If the Oxford movement had never happened, John Henry Newman had not become a Roman Catholic, and Keble College had never been built, John Keble, or more precisely his book of liturgical poetry, The Christian Year, would still have been a name to conjure with throughout the 19th century. Even Lytton Strachey, that waspish debunker of Victorian reputations, claimed that the holy simplicity of the Christian Year carried Keble's name into the remotest lodging houses of England. Strachey might also have added that the Christian Year carried Keble's name to America and many other Anglophone territories. The notion that remote lodging houses were awash with copies of the Christian Year, making it sound rather like the Gideon Bible of its times, may be a little far-fetched, but the distribution figures for the Christian Year are remarkable. Initially published anonymously in 1827, by Keble's death in 1866, there had been 95 editions, and when the copyright expired in 1873, sales stood at 379,000, which, when I compared this with the 1871 census figures, suggests that there was one copy for every 56 inhabitants of the UK. Now, if you allow for book buying capacity and literacy, that suggests that there few literate households can have remained untouched by Keble's verse. The avidity with which commercial publishers, not primarily interested in devotional literature, took the opportunity to print the book after copyright had lapsed suggests the product's continuing marketability. When Dent founded the Everyman Library in 1906, the Christian Year swiftly became part of his list. Many of these copies, given as presents or prizes, may have remained unread, of course, but by the end of the century, there were to be reproductions of every description, facsimiles of the handwritten original, and you will find in the display some of the handwritten poetry. There were miniaturized, pocket-sized versions and lectern-sized, finely bound illustrated editions. Keble College possesses not only the manuscript original, but a number of the subsequent editions, varying from large, ornately illustrated presentation copies, furbished more in the style of 19th century keepsake books, to a chastely bound copy in virginal white, where the title of each poem is presented in red, as if it were a prayer book rubric. Perhaps that was produced as suitable for a confirmation present. Yet, hunting through the index pages of the various modern anthologies of 19th century poetry on my shelves, I could find no mention of Keble. Only anthologies specifically marketed as offering Christian literature featured the odd poem by Keble, who is, of course, easily accommodated within the well-established tradition of the Anglican poet-priest. So why has Keble fallen out of the literary canon? What was his poetic agenda, and the nature of his contribution to 19th century poetry? And what was the lasting legacy of the Christian Year? Well, I'm going to start at the wrong end. I'm going to address the question of the eclipse of Keble's poetry first. Perhaps in hindsight, 1827 was not the best time to have published the Christian Year, a collection of poems which had already been in the making for almost a decade. Admittedly, Tennyson published his first volume of poems only 3 years later, in 1830, but he went on publishing prolifically until shortly before his death in 1892. On the strength of the Christian Year, Keble did go on to occupy the prestigious position of Oxford's Professor of Poetry from 1831 to 1841, but his further volumes of poetry never achieved the popularity or esteem of his first collection. The publication of the Christian Year fell in a period sometimes referred to as belated Romanticism. But Keble's poetry in many ways harks back to the 18th century models such as William Cowper and Thomas Gray, rather than embracing the aesthetic manifesto of Wordsworth and Coleridge as set out in the preface to the second edition of the Lyrical Ballads. The difference between the two styles can be succinctly summarised by contrasting Gray's statement that the language of the age is never the language of poetry, and the late poets declared ambition to use, as far as was possible, a selection of language really used by men. Keble, though much struck by the lyrical ballads when he first encountered them as an undergraduate, was more influenced by other elements of their poetic project than by their diction. And Wordsworth privately considered Keble's poetry as a throwback to the ornate flourishes, extravagant metaphors, and artificially elevated style of the 18th century poets he so excoriated. In fact, he expressed the view that Keble was little better than Watts, an 18th century hymn writer. In as far as Keble felt the influence of Romanticism, it was in a highly selective and attenuated form. For one thing, only Wordsworth, and to a limited extent Coleridge, featured in Keble's romantic pantheon, along with the fiction of Sir Walter Scott. Byron, Keats, and Shelley were dismissed as members of the most vicious of schools. The elements of Romanticism that appealed to Keble as potentially helpful for religious purposes were its reintroduction of the emotions, its celebration of nature, and its appreciation of the Middle Ages as something more than a time sunk in superstitious irrationality. The vogue for the Christian year partly depended upon its filling a need for imaginative reading material appropriate for Sunday consumption. Yet the seeds of its eventual demise were also contained in its conception as devotional literature. Written before geology and evolutionary theory had combined to challenge a God who could be read in the book of nature, or before German higher criticism had complicated reception of the Bible as simply God's word, these verses from Keble's poem For the Fourth Sunday After Trinity were unlikely to speak to those afflicted by religious doubt. In the low chant of wakeful birds and the deep weltering flood, in whispering leaves these solemn words we hear, God made us all for good. All true, all faultless, all in tune, creation's wondrous choir, opened in mystic union to last till time expire. And religious doubts aside, such poetry, celebrating in steady rhythms the virtues of simple faith and total obedience, was wholly unsuited to survive the onslaught of modernism, with its iconoclastic rejection of the Victorian age's cherished forms and assumptions. So, having started by suggesting some of the reasons why Keble's poetry is little read today, I'd like to say something about what it was that persuaded a reluctant Keble in 1827 to publish his poems, and also to sketch something of the aesthetic principles lying behind his poetry. Keble's reputation for modesty and his preference for parochial life should not blind us to his capacity for exerting his considerable influence in championing his high Tory convictions and effectively polarising the Oriel Common Room of the late 1820s. Talk of political reform at this time was producing a near-apocalyptic atmosphere. And I think we can imagine something of that today. And in his reading of the signs of the time, Keble was acutely aware of the gathering threat to the established church, posed by a series of parliamentary bills. In 1827, preparations were in hand for the repeal of the Test Incorporation Acts, which had hitherto, in principle, if not in practice, restricted public positions to communicant members of the Church of England. And it was generally recognised that this was merely a prelude to the Roman Catholic Emancipation Act of 1829, allowing Catholics to sit as members of Parliament. Meanwhile, the Interdenominational British and Foreign Bible Society was busy distributing Bibles which were no longer accompanied by the 1662 Anglican Book of Common Prayer, thus splitting the Bible from the Church's teaching and potentially encouraging the conflicting interpretations which were a hallmark of dissent. The subtitle of Keble's The Christian Year was Thoughts in Verse for the Sundays and Holy Days Throughout the Year, and it should therefore be thought of as a political statement, declaring that the poems were only to be thoroughly understood when read as a devotional meditation accompanying the Anglican lectionary. Similarly political was Keble's preface, or advertisement as it was called, which began, "Next to a sound rule of faith, there is nothing of so much consequence as a sober standard to feeling in matters of practical religion, and it is the peculiar happiness of the Church of England to possess in her authorised formularies an ample and secure provision for both. The emphasis upon a sober standard of feeling could be read as a sideswipe against the enthusiasm of which newer forms of dissent so often stood accused. His friend Hurrell Froude's quip that the Christian Year's poems might cause Keble to be taken for a Methodist must have stung. Keble had not intended his poems to serve as hymns, forming part of a public liturgy. In 1827, hymns were still a form of worship very much associated with Methodism. Indeed, hymn singing had not been permitted in Anglican churches until 1820. In 1827, Keble also entered a poetic world, which continued to be much concerned with the Romantics' debates about the role of poetry and of the poet. Keble's own understanding of poetry was straightforwardly what we've come to describe as instrumentalist, conceiving of his poetic function as intimately connected with his priestly role. It was from this position that his distaste for the vicious school of Shelley, Keats and Byron sprang. Their aesthetic is addressed in his poem for the fourth Sunday after Epiphany, where he asks, "And wilt thou seek again thy howling waste, thy charnel house and chain, and with the demons be, rather than clasp thine own deliverer's knee?" In a final verse, openly alluding to Shelley and Byron's squandering of their aristocratic rank and responsibilities, Keble also offers his own poetic remedy, where the deliverer, he, merciful and mild, as erst beholding, loves his wayward child. When souls of highest birth waste their impassioned might on dream of earth, he opens nature's book, and on his glorious gospel bids them look, till by such chords as rule the choirs above, their lawless cries are tuned to hymns of perfect love. These poets' wayward souls inevitably express themselves in lawless cries and require discipline so that they may come under heavenly rule. The coercive nature of such re-education emerges in that play on chords, primary, of course, musically, but carrying also the oral suggestion of binding ropes required to achieve such retuning. Deploring late Romanticism's focus on introspection or obsessive interest in death, the poem proposes an alternative Christian syllabus, developed further in the first two verses of Keble's most frequently cited poem, Septuagesima Sunday. There is a book, who runs may read, which heavenly truth imparts, and all the law its scholars need, pure eyes and Christian hearts. The works of God above, below, within us and around are pages in that book to show how God himself is found. Language, the Bible and nature itself were all to be understood as forms through which God might be glimpsed. In that these truths were mysteries, the first verse suggests they could only be apprehended through the eyes of faith and were not to be deduced by relying upon human logic, as the rationalist teachings of natural theology had supposed. If the notion of God's revelation as implicit within his creation placed the obligation of attentive reading upon believers, it also required the faithful to place their spiritual instruction under the authority of the Church and its appointed ministers. This education, in turn, required penitence and purification, and its effectiveness could be seen in the fruits of the Spirit. The dew of heaven is like thy grace. It steals in silence down, but where it lights, the favoured place by richest fruits is known. The poem might start by claiming that pure eyes and Christian hearts were all that was required to discern God in his creation, but Keble takes no chances. As poet-priest, he expounds the process. The moon above, the church below, a wondrous race they run, but all their radiance, all their glow, each borrows of its sun. Later in the poem, he claims 2 worlds are ours. 'Tis only sin forbids us to descry the mystic heaven and earth within, plain as the sea and sky. Yet this scarcely seems just. Those familiar with metaphysical poetry could easily appreciate the pun on sun at the end there, which makes the comparison between the moon and the church work for us. But most readers, however pure in heart, require initiation in the code of analogical correspondences Keble is using, derived in part from the biblical texts which appear as footnotes to the poem, and from the typological interpretations of biblical characters, stories, and images developed by the early fathers of the church. We can also see in this poem the practiced sermon giver in the way which Keble modulates from the inclusive our and us of corporate worship used throughout the poem to the final verse, which enables the poem to be used by the individual member of the congregation or the solitary reader. Thou who hast given me eyes to see and love this sight so fair, give me a heart to find out thee and read thee everywhere. Then there's the question of rhyme and metre. Unlike his prose tracts directed to fellow clergy, which often express cautious hesitation in formulating an opinion, the interpretative system Keble articulates here brooks no gainsayers. And then this poem has partly to do with what one of his sterner 20th century literary critics termed the sickeningly regular beat of his poetry. The two poems I've already quoted from show that Keble was capable of metrical variation, but his tendency to use a tightly controlled rhyme scheme or a clinching couplet at the end of a verse emphasises his role as the undisputed priestly channel of God's truth. In his lectures of the 1830s, Keble was to describe poetry as the handmaid of religion, in that it had afforded the regularity, the modulations, the changes of rhythm, the use of language, sometimes restrained, sometimes eager and passionate, and all those other methods which all men feel after, but only a few can express. Moreover, a true and holy religion will turn such aids to the fullest account, because it, most of all, feels itself overwhelmed in the presence of the boundless vastness of the universe. As this quotation implies, poetry for Keble sprang from feeling, but employed the discipline of poetry both to call upon, restrain, and so represent the profound emotions evoked by God. Following Keble's poetic credo, poet and reader alike were taught to see religious verse as a part of a private devotional habit, in which poetic forms served, much in the way liturgical worship did, to channel and focus thoughts and feelings. Which brings me finally to the influence of the Christian year. Having created a market for devotional poetry, it spawned many imitative volumes. Poetry, with its reliance on symbol and metaphor to convey their sacramental understanding of the world, lay at the heart of the Oxford movement's enterprise. And possibly the verse written by so many of their leading figures was ultimately to prove the most pervasive and long-lasting of their writings. For Tractarian poets and versifiers, Keble's collection offered ways through which the emotions, so often particularly suspected of leading women astray, could be disciplined by imitating his examples of liturgical and metrical forms. Keble himself wrote the preface for The Child's Christian Year in 1842, produced by one of his parishioners, Francis Young, whose daughter Charlotte Young wrote a poem-by-poem commentary shortly after Keble's death on Keble's collection entitled Musings over the Christian Year. And she went on herself in 1880 to publish Verses on the Gospels for Sundays and Holy Days. You can see the trajectory. If anyone could have been said to be responsible for transmitting the spirit of Keble's writing and teaching to rich and poor alike and to far-flung parts of the empire, it was Charlotte Young, for whom he had been parish priest, catechist, and editor of her earlier novels. The best-selling out of her some 200 publications was a novel entitled The Heir of Redcliffe, published in 1853, which provided a fictional primer for appreciating the educative importance of Keble's lectures on poetry. Incidentally, she had read them in the original Latin, because they weren't translated into English until 1912. Keble's initial reluctance to publish his poetry, which could be justified only by its purpose of revealing Christian truth, also provided an important model. Both Frederick William Faber and Gerard Manley Hopkins, two poet-priests who spent formative years under the influence of Tractarianism, were to suppress their own poetic impulse for considerable periods when they doubted it formed part of God's purpose for them. But on the other hand, Keble also helped to legitimate women's voices. William Rossetti may have claimed that his sister Christina thought nothing of Keble as a poet. Yet, she carefully illustrated her copies of the Christian Year, and its influence is to be felt in series of poems she wrote, such as Some Feasts and Fasts. Like Hopkins, Christina Rossetti used far more adventurous verse forms than Keble's, and where repressed emotion, acting as a healing balm, had formed Keble's idea for poetry, the desire to attain peace is more often the note to be found in their rather more personal poetry. The influence of Keble's poetry can also be traced more broadly in the meditative tone of much Victorian poetry. Tennyson's In Memoriam bears its traces. Indeed, Hurrell Froude's younger brother, the historian James Anthony Froude, was to describe In Memoriam as being, for sceptics, what the Christian Year was to Orthodox churchmen. Composed over 17 years, rather than the decade it had taken Keble for the Christian Year, In Memoriam also uses chronological cycles as its unifying structure, and a regular, though immensely flexible, verse form. And what of Matthew Arnold, Keble's godson, whose sense of nature as indifferent to human concerns and concept of man as essentially solitary fought with Keble's vision as much as his father's faith? Arnold may have moved away from Keble's view of poetry as religion's handmaid to believing that the power of poetry itself to interpret life for us, to console us and sustain us. But the conviction he shared with his godfather that poetry should be effective as well as affective made him despair of and abandon his own elegiac verse. As the 19th century progressed, the Christian Year achieved symbolic status. For the novelist William Thackeray's fictional alter ego, Arthur Pendennis, it spoke of an innocent adolescence when he and his mother would read it together. Faint, very faint, and seldom in afterlife, Pendennis heard that solemn church music. But he always loved the remembrance of it, and of the times when it struck his heart, and he walked over the fields full of hope and void of doubt as the church bells rang on a Sunday morning. In Thomas Hardy's late 19th century novel, Jude the Obscure, the Christian Year carries two contrasting connotations. On the one hand, it reminded Hardy, and his character Jude, of the poetry inherent in Tractarianism, as they both first encountered it as young men in Dorset, where Hardy himself had bought, annotated, and committed to heart many of Keble's poems. Latterly, however, it had become a token for ostentatious religiosity, as displayed in the shape of the novel's grim, spinsterly Oxford landlady, who wore a cross and beads round her neck as her only ornament, and knew the Christian Year by heart. Yet despite the volume's anti-dissenting origins and occasional use as a badge of militant Anglo-Catholicism, some of its poems and the hymns which have been extracted from them became familiar and welcome in nonconformist circles. D.H. Lawrence, for instance, raised as a Congregationalist, recalled that at his board school, the final hymn of the day was Keble's Evening Hymn, which, though it meant little to him by way of dogma or doctrine, still as an adult penetrated me with wonder and the mystery of twilight. Curiously, Keble might have been best pleased by the agnostic George Eliot's tribute to his volume in The Mill on the Floss, where her young heroine is at first uninterested in the volume found on a market stall, discarding it as a mere hymn book, but learns to find it consoling as repeated readings filled her mind with a continual stream of rhythmic memories. If nowadays we recall anything of the Christian year, it is probably by way of such rhythmic memories acquired at school or in church or chapel. By such means, we possibly quite unconsciously absorbed something of that ethos which came to be known as Tractarian and was inherent in Keble's long-lived volume from its very first poem, with which I will end. The trivial round, the common task, would finish all we ought to ask, room to deny ourselves, a road to bring us daily nearer God. Thank you.